The trench is waist-deep in water. It has been waist-deep for 11 days. The men of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, stand in it because they have been ordered to stand in it. Their feet have not been dry in nearly 2 weeks. Private Thomas Hartley is 23 years old. He has survived 3 German bombardments in the past week. He has watched men die beside him, their bodies torn apart by high explosive shells. But this morning, when he tries to climb the fire step for stand 2, his legs collapse beneath him. He has not been shot. He has not been wounded by shrapnel. His feet simply no longer work. He removes his boot. The smell hits him immediately. Rot, decay, something sweet and sickening. His foot is grey-white, swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The skin comes away in sheets when he touches it. He cannot feel his toes. He has not felt them for 3 days, but he said nothing because men do not report sick for numb feet. Not in this army, not in this war. By noon, Hartley is being carried out of the line on a stretcher. He is one of 17 men evacuated from his company that day. None of them have been hit by enemy fire. All of them have the same condition. All of them have lost the use of their feet. This is trench foot. And in the autumn of 1917, it is destroying the British Army faster than German artillery. World War I is remembered for its weapons. The machine gun, the howitzer, poison gas, industrial killing on a scale never before imagined. But there was another weapon in the trenches, one that killed and maimed with ruthless efficiency, and it required no shells, no bullets, no chemical agents. It required only water, cold, and time. Trench foot was not a wound, it was a collapse, a breakdown of living tissue caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions. It attacked the feet first, destroying circulation, damaging nerves, rotting flesh. In its mildest forms, it left men unable to walk for weeks. In its most severe, it required amputation, and it was everywhere. Between 1914 and 1918, trench foot disabled over 200,000 British soldiers alone. The French army reported comparable numbers. The German army, entrenched in Flanders' flooded lowlands, suffered catastrophic rates of infection in 1914 and 1915. When the United States entered the war in 1917, American divisions began reporting cases within weeks of reaching the Western Front. This was not a minor affliction, it was not a footnote. Trench foot removed entire battalions from combat. It filled casualty clearing stations with men who had never seen the enemy. It left tens of thousands of soldiers permanently disabled, unable to return to civilian work, dependent on meager pensions for the rest of their lives. And for the first 2 years of the war, command structures across all armies treated it with indifference bordering on contempt. To understand trench foot, one must first abandon the notion that it was simply frozen feet. It was not frostbite, though the symptoms could appear similar. Frostbite required freezing temperatures. Trench foot did not. It thrived in conditions between 0 and 10 degrees Celsius. It required only moisture, cold, and immobility. The process was medical, mechanical, and merciless. A soldier stands in a flooded trench. His boots are soaked through. Water seeps into his socks, saturating the wool, clinging to his skin. The cold constricts the blood vessels in his feet and lower legs. Circulation slows. Oxygen delivery to tissue diminishes. Cells begin to starve. At first, the soldier feels nothing unusual. Perhaps his feet are cold. Perhaps they ache. But he is in the trenches, where everything aches, and he is surrounded by men in identical conditions. Cold feet are not worth mentioning. Hours pass, then days. The soldier does not remove his boots because he has been ordered not to remove his boots. In some sectors, battalion standing orders explicitly prohibit the removal of footwear in the front line. The reasoning is simple. If men remove their boots, their feet will swell, and they will be unable to get the boots back on. Better to keep them on. Better to endure. So the soldier stands, and his feet continue to drown. The skin turns pale, then white, then a greyish blue. Sensation fades, the numbness is almost a relief, but inside the tissue, catastrophe is unfolding. Blood vessels are collapsing, nerve fibers are degrading. In severe cases, tissue is beginning to die. When the soldier finally removes his boot, either because he can no longer bear it, or because he has been ordered to for inspection, He discovers that his foot no longer resembles a foot. It is swollen, discolored, sometimes blistered. In advanced cases, the skin sloughs off in strips. The toenails fall away. The flesh beneath is black. And then the pain arrives. The return of circulation was agony. Men who had felt nothing for days suddenly experienced burning, stabbing pain so intense that they screamed. Some passed out. Others begged medics not to touch them, not to move them, not to bring their feet near warmth because the sensation was unbearable. Lance Corporal William Fletcher, 8th Battalion, East Lancashire Regiment, was evacuated from the Ypres salient in December 1915. His account, recorded weeks later at a casualty clearing station, describes the moment his feet began to thaw. It was worse than being shot. I know, because I was shot at Neuve-Chapelle, and this was worse. It felt like my feet were on fire, like someone was holding them in a furnace. The medic told me to stay still, but I couldn't stop moving. I thought I was going to die from it. Fletcher did not die, but he lost 3 toes on his left foot and 2 on his right. He never returned to the front. Medical officers in 1914 and 1915 were often baffled by trench foot. Many had never encountered the condition before. It did not fit into established categories of combat injury. It was not a wound, it was not frostbite, because the temperature was not cold enough. Some initially misdiagnosed it as rheumatism or nerve damage. Others suspected malingering. But by the winter of 1915, the scale of the problem had become impossible to ignore. In the Ypres salient, the British 14th Division reported over 1,200 cases of trench foot in November 1915 alone. This was one division in one sector in 1 month. The 14th Division had arrived in Belgium with approximately 12,000 men. 10% of that strength was evacuated not due to combat, but due to feet. The 47th London Division, holding positions near Loos, reported similar figures. In some battalions, entire companies were rendered non-effective. Platoons that had survived German assaults found themselves unable to move when ordered to advance because half the men could not stand. Regimental medical officers were overwhelmed. Casualty clearing stations, designed to treat bullet wounds and shrapnel injuries, found themselves filled with men whose feet had turned black. Amputations became routine. Surgeons who had spent months removing fragments of shell casing now spent their days removing toes, feet, and in the worst cases, portions of lower legs. The German army faced identical conditions. In the autumn of 1914, German infantry divisions entrenched in Flanders experienced catastrophic rates of trench foot. The German Fourth Army, holding positions near Ypres, reported over 12,000 cases between October and December 1914. Many of these men had been elite formations, veterans of the opening campaigns. They had survived the Battle of the Marne. They had marched hundreds of kilometers, and now they were being evacuated because they could not feel their feet. One German battalion commander, writing in December 1914, described the condition as an enemy we cannot fight, cannot see, and cannot escape. The French army, entrenched across vast sectors of the Western Front, suffered in equal measure. French infantry regiments holding flooded positions near the Somme and in Champagne reported thousands of cases through the winters of 1914, 1915, and 1916. French military hospitals treated trench foot with the same bewilderment and limited resources as their British and German counterparts. The condition did not discriminate. It attacked all armies with impartial brutality. To stand in a World War I trench during winter was to occupy a space designed for slow destruction. The trenches were not dry, fortified positions. They were ditches carved into mud, clay, and chalk, and they filled with water as predictably as graves. In Flanders, where the water table sat less than a meter below the surface, trenches flooded within hours of being dug. Drainage systems collapsed under bombardment. Duckboards, the wooden slats meant to keep men's feet above water, broke apart or sank into the mud. In many sectors, there were no duckboards at all. Men stood in water, they slept in water, they ate in water, they fought in water. Private Albert Johnson, 1st Battalion, Lincolnshire Regiment, described conditions in the Ypres salient in late 1915. We stood in water up to our knees for 6 days straight. You couldn't sit down, there was nowhere to sit. You couldn't lie down. You just stood there leaning against the trench wall, trying to stay awake. Your feet went numb after the first day. By the third day, you couldn't feel anything below your ankles. By the fifth day, you didn't care. This was not unusual. This was standard. Across the Western Front, hundreds of thousands of men stood in identical conditions, waiting for relief that often did not come. Rotation schedules, in theory, moved units out of the front line after a set period, typically 4 to 6 days. In practice, rotation was frequently delayed. Attacks disrupted schedules. Reinforcements failed to arrive. Units remained in the line for weeks, standing in the same flooded trenches, wearing the same soaked boots, waiting for orders that told them to hold position. And their feet rotted. The German army had learned the dangers of trench foot by the winter of 1914. Units holding the low ground in Flanders suffered horrific casualties from the condition. But lessons learned at the battalion level did not always reach higher command, and even when they did, implementation was slow. German infantry regiments began experimenting with preventive measures as early as December 1914. Some units issued whale oil to rub into feet. Others enforced mandatory boot removal and foot inspections. In certain sectors, German soldiers were issued wooden clogs to wear inside dugouts, keeping their leather boots dry. These measures worked, but they required time, resources, and most critically, the ability to remove men from the front line for rest. In a static war, where both sides held entrenched positions that could not be abandoned, finding time for foot care was nearly impossible. The British Army took longer to respond. Through much of 1915, trench foot was treated not as a medical crisis, but as a disciplinary problem. Some battalion commanders believed that men were allowing themselves to develop the condition as a means of escaping the front line. Court-martials were held. Men were accused of self-inflicted injury, of neglecting their duty to maintain their own health. This was not just callous, it was ignorant. Trench foot was not something a soldier could prevent through willpower. It required dry socks, dry boots, regular rotation, and the ability to remove footwear and massage circulation back into freezing feet. Most soldiers had none of these things. By late 1915, senior British commanders began to recognize the scale of the disaster. Directives were issued, units were ordered to implement foot inspections. Medical officers were instructed to treat trench foot as a serious condition rather than malingering, but the damage had already been done. Winter 1916, the Somme, the battle had ended, but the trenches remained. The 8th Division of the British Army held positions near Beaumont Hamel, entrenched in shell-cratered ground that had turned into a freezing swamp. In January 1916, the division reported over 800 cases of trench foot in a single week. Among them was Corporal James Brennan, 2nd Battalion Rifle Brigade. Brennan had survived the Somme offensive. He had survived German counterattacks. He had been buried twice by shell explosions and dug out both times. But in the first week of January, standing in a flooded trench, his feet began to fail. The numbness crept up slowly. First the toes, then the arch, then the entire foot. He mentioned it to no one. Men did not report numb feet, not unless they wanted to be accused of cowardice. On the third day, Brennan tried to climb out of the trench to retrieve a supply crate. His legs gave out beneath him. He fell forward, unable to catch himself, and fractured his wrist. The medic who treated the wrist noticed his feet. They were grey, swollen, and cold to the touch. Brennan was evacuated immediately. At the casualty clearing station, doctors removed his boots. The skin of his feet came away with his socks. The flesh beneath was black in places, white in others, and bleeding from dozens of ruptured blisters. Brennan was conscious throughout the examination. He later recalled the smell more than the pain, rot and decay, as if his feet were already dead. He lost 4 toes. The doctors told him he was fortunate. Other men in the same ward had lost entire feet. Brennan never returned to the front. He was discharged in March 1917 with a pension of 10 shillings per week. He spent the rest of his life unable to walk without pain. The irony was inescapable. World War I was the most technologically advanced conflict in human history. Armies fielded aircraft, tanks, and artillery pieces capable of firing shells 20 kilometers. Chemical weapons could kill thousands in minutes. Industrial production reached levels unimaginable a decade earlier, and yet soldiers were being disabled by wet feet. The contradiction was not lost on those who experienced it. Men who had survived artillery barrages that obliterated entire companies found themselves evacuated because they could not feel their toes. Soldiers who had charged through machine gun fire collapsed in trenches because their feet no longer functioned. This was not heroic, it was not glorious, it was humiliating. Some men refused evacuation even when ordered. They believed that being removed from the line for trench foot marked them as weak, as failures. In an army where courage was measured by endurance under fire, being wounded without being shot felt like shame. Others welcomed evacuation not out of cowardice but out of sheer desperation. The pain, once circulation returned, was unbearable. Men begged to be taken to casualty clearing stations. Some wept openly when medics arrived. The condition created a strange calculus of suffering. A bullet wound was honorable. Shell fragments were proof of enemy action. But trench foot was the result of standing in water. It was not something you earned. It was something that happened to you because the army had failed to keep your feet dry. By 1917, the British Army had implemented comprehensive measures to combat trench foot. These measures worked, but they required resources, discipline, and constant enforcement. Every soldier was issued 2 pairs of socks. 1 pair was worn. The other was kept dry inside the tunic, warmed by body heat. Socks were rotated daily. Boots were removed at least once every 24 hours, even in the front line. Feet were rubbed with whale oil to maintain circulation and create a waterproof barrier. Foot inspections became mandatory. Officers who failed to enforce foot care protocols faced disciplinary action. The results were immediate and dramatic. In divisions where these measures were strictly enforced, cases of trench foot dropped by over 80%. The 51st Highland Division, which had suffered over 600 cases in the winter of 1915 to 1916, reported fewer than 50 cases in the winter of 1917 to 1918. But enforcement was uneven. In some units, foot care became a ritual. In others, it was ignored. Battalion commanders obsessed with maintaining frontline strength sometimes refused to rotate men out of flooded positions, believing that any loss of manpower weakened defensive capability. These decisions had consequences. The 34th Division, holding positions near Arras in November 1917, suffered over 1,100 cases of trench foot in a 3-week period. The division's commander had refused to implement regular foot inspections, believing them a waste of time. By the end of November, the division was so depleted that it had to be withdrawn from the line entirely for rest and reinforcement. One officer, writing years later, described the division's condition as a self-inflicted disaster, entirely preventable, and entirely the result of command failure. The United States Army entered World War I in April 1917. American divisions began arriving in France in the summer and autumn of that year. They arrived with modern equipment, high morale, and almost no experience of trench warfare. Within weeks, they began experiencing trench foot. The 1st Division, deployed to a quiet sector near Toul in November 1917, reported over 200 cases of trench foot within the first month. The 26th Division, sent to the front lines in February 1918, suffered similar rates. American medical officers, many of whom had never treated the condition before, were forced to rely on British and French expertise. American soldiers learned the same brutal lesson that British, French, and German soldiers had learned before them. Modern technology could not protect you from cold water. Industrial might could not keep your feet dry, and if you did not take care of your feet would fail. The US Army adapted quickly. By the spring of 1918, American divisions had implemented the same preventive measures that the British and French armies had developed through years of bitter experience: sock rotation, whale oil, foot inspections, mandatory boot removal. The measures worked, but they could not erase the damage already done. Trench foot did not end with the war. It followed men home. Veterans who had survived with their feet intact often discovered, years later, that the damage had been permanent. Circulation never fully recovered. Nerve damage left feet numb, hypersensitive, or in constant pain. Some men could not wear shoes without agony. Others developed chronic infections that required repeated surgeries. In Britain, thousands of veterans applied for disability pensions related to trench foot. Many were denied. The condition was difficult to prove. X-rays showed nothing. Amputations were obvious, but nerve damage and circulation problems were invisible. Medical boards, tasked with reducing pension costs, often ruled that trench foot was not a war injury because it had not been caused by enemy action. This was technically true and morally grotesque. Trench foot was a war injury. It had been caused by war. It had disabled men in service to their country, but because it had not been inflicted by a bullet or a shell, it did not count. Veterans organizations fought these decisions. Newspapers published accounts of men left destitute because their trench foot was not considered a legitimate disability. Slowly, grudgingly, pension boards began to recognize the condition. But for many men, recognition came too late. In France, the situation was similar. French veterans with trench foot-related disabilities faced bureaucratic indifference. In Germany, already devastated by economic collapse and hyperinflation, veterans' pensions were rendered nearly worthless. Men who had lost feet in the trenches found themselves begging on city streets. The war had ended, the suffering had not. Trench foot changed military logistics forever. The lesson was simple: if you do not take care of your soldiers' feet, you do not have soldiers. World War II armies remembered this lesson. British, American, and German forces all implemented comprehensive foot care protocols. Soldiers were issued multiple pairs of socks. Boot rotation was mandatory. Medical officers conducted regular inspections. In the Pacific Theatre, where wet conditions mirrored the trenches of Flanders, foot care became a command priority. The results spoke for themselves. Trench foot rates in World War II were a fraction of what they had been in World War I. The condition still occurred, particularly in jungle warfare and winter operations, but it never again disabled entire divisions. This was not because World War II soldiers were tougher. It was because World War II armies had learned that neglect was expensive. Keeping men combat effective required more than weapons and ammunition. It required socks, boots, and the time to remove them. The British Army in Italy, fighting through the mountains in 1943 and 1944, made foot care a daily ritual. American forces in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge enforced strict foot inspection protocols even during active combat. German forces on the Eastern Front, despite catastrophic supply shortages, prioritized footwear and sock distribution. These were not luxuries, they were necessities, and the reason every World War II commander knew this was because World War I had taught them. Trench foot was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was not designed, it was not manufactured, it could not be aimed, but it destroyed armies with efficiency that artillery could only envy. It required no shells, no explosives, no poison gas. It required only water, cold, and indifference. And for the first 2 years of World War I, all three were abundant. The men who suffered from trench foot were not cowards, they were not malingerers. They were soldiers ordered to stand in flooded trenches, wearing boots that could not keep water out, waiting for relief that often did not come. They followed orders, they endured, and their feet rotted. By the time command structures recognized the problem, hundreds of thousands of men had already been disabled. The cost was not measured only in individuals, it was measured in battalions that could not attack, in divisions that had to be withdrawn, in entire armies weakened not by enemy action, but by their own failure to keep their soldiers' feet dry. The statistics are staggering. Over 200,000 British soldiers evacuated for trench foot, comparable numbers in the French army, tens of thousands in the German army, thousands more in the American Expeditionary Force. And these are only the cases severe enough to require evacuation. Countless others suffered milder forms, remaining in the line but unable to march, to run, or to move quickly under fire. How many attacks failed because men could not advance? How many defensive positions collapsed because men could not retreat? How many soldiers died because their comrades could not run to help them? These questions have no answers, but the evidence suggests that trench foot shaped the war as much as any technology, any tactic, any battle. In the end, trench foot was a failure of imagination. Military planners had anticipated machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. They had not anticipated that men standing in water would lose the use of their feet. They had not considered that wet socks could disable an army. This failure was not unique to one nation, it was universal. Every army faced trench foot. Every army dismissed it at first. Every army eventually learned, but the learning curve was measured in hundreds of thousands of disabled men. The lesson of trench foot is simple. Wars are not fought only with weapons. They are fought with logistics, with boots, socks, and drainage, with the mundane, unglamorous work of keeping soldiers healthy enough to fight. World War I demonstrated this lesson with brutal clarity, and the cost of that lesson was paid not by generals or politicians, but by the men standing in flooded trenches, watching their feet turn grey and wondering if they would ever walk again. Trench foot did not make headlines, it did not win battles, it did not change the course of history in any single dramatic moment, but over 4 years it disabled hundreds of thousands of men, weakened every army that fought, and left a legacy of permanent injury that lasted for decades. It was, perhaps, the most destructive weapon of World War I, and it was entirely preventable.